Welcome on board, students. In this lesson we are discussing about reflex action, and reflex is a rapid automatic response to an external stimuli, and examples of this external stimuli includes pain, heat, cold, among others like temperature, humidity, etc. So we have two types of reflex: simple and conditional. In simple reflex action, there is a specific single and automatic response to a particular stimuli. Examples of simple reflex action include sneezing, withdrawing hand from a hot object, coughing, knee jerk when the knee is tapped. So when that part called patella on the knee is hit, for example, using a ruler, so there is that knee jerk. We have salivation, secretion of tears when the onion is cut, as examples of simple reflex action. This reflex does not depend on learning. Now let us consider a reflex action that leads to withdrawal of a hand from a hot object. First, what will happen is that the receptors in the skin are stimulated. The nerve impulses are triggered off and transmitted through the sensory neuron, from the sensory neuron to the gray matter in the spinal cord. Then from the gray matter in the spinal cord across a synapse to the CNS, which is the white matter, through the relay neuron in the gray matter, then to the motor neuron. From there, the effector organs or the biceps of the upper arm contract, and then the hand is withdrawn from the hot object. So we have the receptors of the skin when we touch a hot object, then nerve impulse is triggered, and then it is transported all the way to the spinal cord, or the gray matter in the spinal cord. Then from this spinal cord, gray matter of the spinal cord to the white matter through a synapse here, okay, then through the relay neuron into the gray matter, then to the motor neuron. From there, the biceps or the effector muscles, so we have the motor neuron. From there, the effector neuron here, the bicep contracts and the hand is withdrawn. So you drop the hot pan. So we move to conditioned reflex action, and this is a response caused by unilateral stimulus or associated stimulus which substitutes the normal stimulus. Unilateral means moving from one particular direction. This one is automatic, and it involves the spinal cord, and it is usually learned, e.g. writing, cycling, and dancing. It involves the interaction of highly specialized centers of the brain with a large number of neurons necessary to bring about conditioning. For example, the experiment carried out by Ivan Pavlov using dogs. So Ivan Pavlov experimented with the dogs by ringing a bell. So he used to associate the bell with food. Then the dog would salivate when the bell was rung, knowing that food was on the way. So he did that several times until he removed food but rang the bell. So as soon as the dog heard the bell, still it salivated even if food was not brought. So that is conditioning. So what are the differences between reflex and conditional? Simple reflex and conditional reflex. So in simple reflex, it is independent of experience, but conditioned reflex is dependent on experience. For example, cycling, writing, if you don't cycle for long, you forget, so it has to be reinforced. But for simple reflex like sneezing, you don't have to have experience on how to sneeze. Then in simple reflex, one stimulus is required to evoke response. But in conditioned reflex, both substitute and original reflex evoke response. In simple reflex, some sensory and motor neurons are used. But for the case of conditioned reflex, the sensory component is replaced, but the motor remains unchanged. When we come to simple reflex, the reflex is simple, but in condition it is complex or modified. So we want to look at the transmission of a nerve impulse. And how do we define a nerve impulse? It is an electrical charge arising from changes in ionic concentration across the surface of a nerve fiber. So this is a nerve fiber. And the ions involved are sodium and potassium. So we have two ways in which a nerve impulse is discharged. We have the resting membrane potential and acting membrane potential. But for now, let us look at resting membrane potential. When it is resting, we say it is an unconducting nerve fiber. In this state, there are more sodium ions outside than the axon inside in relation to a lot of sodium ions which are more within the cell. This results in more positive charges outside the cell. You can see this plus and negative charge inside the exoplasm. You can see dash dash, hence the membrane is polarized. And when something is polar, it is having both negative and positive charges. If that is the case, sodium is pumped out by a mechanism called sodium or pump. So sodium is extruded, is pumped in through a mechanism called sodium pump. And that follows diffusion of potassium freely in and out of the exoplasm after sodium pump. The next is the action potential. This is a localized change in electrical charge between the ion inside and outside the nerve fiber when stimulated. The inside becomes more positively charged than the outside, hence causing a state called depolarization. Sodium pump stops temporarily, causing a diffusion of sodium into the exoplasm. So you can see sodium begins to enter the cell. Now, if the sodium enters the cell, the concentration rises within the exoplasm. If there is more concentration of sodium within the exoplasm, then potassium will diffuse out, or they leave the cell. So the movement of action potential along a nerve fiber constitute a nerve impulse. So to wind up this lesson, we want to look at transmission of a nerve impulse across a synapse, which is also called a neurojunction. So a synapse is the junction or connection between two dendrites of two adjacent neuron or neighboring neurons. So when you have two neighboring neurons, each having dendrites at the end, there is a junction called synapse. Therefore, a nerve impulse can be defined as an electrical charge arising from the changes in ionic concentration across the surface of the nerve fiber. So when we have the changes in the concentration of ions across the surface of the nerve fiber, then it results into a nerve impulse. So the impulse arrives at the synaptic knob and causes the vesicle to move to the presynaptic knob. What happens is that the vesicle will discharge a transmitter substance called acetylcholine into synaptic cleft, and that makes the membrane to be permeable. After that, acetylcholine diffuses across the cleft and attaches to the postsynaptic membrane. It results in sodium ions from the cleft flowing through the postsynaptic cleft, and in that case the membrane is said to be depolarized and an action potential is generated. After that, the acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft is destroyed by enzyme cholinesterase into inactive choline and acetic acid. These two are reabsorbed by the axon terminals and reconstituted or put together to make acetylcholine using adenosine triphosphate. We conclude that lesson with this assignment. Goodbye, and we will meet during the next lesson. So test yourself, test your confidence with this assignment.